Traction's mixer. Newcomers to Tracktion often wonder why it doesn't have a mixer. Of course, Tracktion does have a mixer, otherwise we would only be able to play back one track at a time. The key difference between Tracktion and most of its rivals is that Traction's mixer is completely integrated into the arrange page and makes no attempt to look like a traditional hardware mixer. So, instead of a fixed architecture with identical channels for every track, Tracktion lets you customize each channel. The level meter filter can be dragged pre-fader, for example, or extra volume and pan filters can be added for precise control of the gain structure through a chain of plugs. Or you can choose to delete the volume and level meters on a MIDI track that feeds a hardware MIDI output. Likewise, rather than provide identical dynamics and EQ controls for each channel, Tracktion provides a selection of suitable native filters and a collection of Mackie plugs which can be added as and when they are needed. Alternatively, you could use third-party VST plugs if you prefer. The volume and pan filters are probably the most important tools when mixing. The volume can be adjusted directly from the arrange page by clicking and dragging vertically in the main area of the filter, while hovering over the level bar allows you to pan by dragging horizontally. Tracktion implements an unusual pan law, which passes centrally panned signals at unity gain, but boosts signals panned hard left or right by 6 dB. This means that you can add as many volume and pan filters to a track as you need, with no overall loss of gain when they are all set to unity and panned centrally. But if you wish to simply route a mono signal to the left or right channel without changing its gain, you will need to drop the volume by 6 dB to compensate. Or alternatively, use a patch bay filter instead. If the signal is stereo, the pan control will become a balance control. When dealing with large numbers of tracks, you might find that pressing F8 to squeeze all tracks onto the screen results in very narrow track lanes, and the volume filters may be too small to adjust properly. One way around this is to select the filter you wish to adjust and make the changes in the Properties panel instead. This method also allows you to type in exact values, which can be a good way to make very small changes. Alternatively, hold Ctrl and use the mouse wheel to zoom vertically until the volume filters are a convenient size, then release Ctrl and use the mouse wheel to scroll the filters area vertically. Each track also has mute and solo buttons at the far right, which can't be deleted. Soloing will mute all tracks except the soloed track, and is cumulative by default, so you can solo multiple tracks together and unsolo them individually. If you hold Ctrl before soloing another track, all previously soloed tracks will be muted again. This behaviour can be reversed in the User Interface tab of the Settings page. Changing the Solo Behaviour option to Exclusive Solo will mean you need to hold Ctrl to solo 2 or more tracks together. Muting a track will disable all filters on that track, so they will consume no CPU until you unmute them again. It is also possible to disable individual filters by selecting them and pressing F. A useful trick for comparing two different plugs is to disable one of them, then hold Ctrl to select them both together. Now, pressing the F key will allow you to make an A/B comparison of the two different effects by toggling bypass for both alternately. The routing for each track is set in the Properties panel when the track is selected. The default audio output will route the track to whichever pair of outputs you chose in the Settings page. Choosing these outputs directly will have exactly the same result, except they will not change automatically should you change your default outputs in future. Any other outputs you have enabled will also show in this list, so you can split all your tracks to separate outputs to be mixed outside of Tracktion if required. The destination list also includes all other tracks in the edit, however, which allows a track or several tracks to be routed to another to create a subgroup. This allows you to, for example, route all your drum tracks to a single group so that you can easily control the level of the kit as a whole, or process the whole submix with compression or EQ. Subgroups can also be routed to further subgroups. For example, I may decide to group the top and bottom snare mics together before routing them onto the main drum group. Routing to other tracks like this does not route the audio to the input of the track itself. In other words, pressing record will not record the mixed audio onto the group track, as this would normally be done with the render function. Instead, you should think of it as just routing the signal through that track's filter section. The track lane of the group track would normally not be used at all, although it can be useful to display automation data if required. If the group track uses a plug that takes MIDI data as well as audio, however, then the MIDI clips can be placed on the group track. Folder tracks are a useful new feature in version 3 and can be helpful when mixing as well as allowing you to organise your tracks better. Select a group of tracks and press the Create Folder Containing button. The resulting folder has a track lane with the folder name and the overview clips, and this track also has a VCA filter in its filter section. VCA stands for Voltage Controlled Amplifier, which is a term inherited from analog mixers which allow the channel faders to be assigned to VCA groups. In such a mixer, each VCA group would have a master fader, which could be used to scale the volume levels of all channels assigned to it. So if you assigned all your drum channels to VCA group 1, you could use the relevant VCA fader to adjust the level of the whole drum kit together. And unlike a subgroup, channels assigned to a VCA group can all be routed differently. Tracktion's approach is slightly different, and obviously being digital, it doesn't really use voltage control. However, the VCA filter on the folder track will affect all volume and pan filters contained within the folder, exactly as if they were assigned to a VCA group on a traditional mixer. Lowering the VCA level by 3 dB will drop the levels of all that folder's volume and pan filters by the same amount. This allows you to adjust the level of a folder as a whole without needing to expand it and edit all the individual tracks. Unlike volume and pan filters, VCA filters cannot be deleted or copied and pasted, but selecting one will provide the same reset to unity and mute options as a normal volume filter. Tracktion will not allow you to add further filters to a folder track, because the tracks within can all have different routings. To process all the tracks in a folder through a single effect, you would need to first mix those signals together via a subgroup. This can be easily achieved, however. Simply select the folder track and use the routing options in the Properties panel to set the routing for all its tracks. The resulting subgroup can then be dragged into the folder if needed. Though if you do this, you should be aware that the VCA filter will now affect the group track level as well as the source track levels. So dropping the VCA level by 3 dB will now result in an overall gain change of 6 dB for the whole folder. You can fix this by selecting the volume filter on the group track and pressing the Ignore VCA button in the Properties panel. Traditional auxiliary sends can also be set up using the aux send and aux return filters in the Tracktion filters list. To set up a post-fade send to feed an effect such as reverb, Start by dragging an AUX return filter onto an empty track, and name the track Reverb Return. If you select the return filter, its properties panel contains options to select one of 8 possible buses, with options to name them underneath. If this is the first AUX send you are adding to the edit, then bus 1 will do fine, and we can name it Reverb. The return filter icon displays the bus name you assign, along with an R prefix to indicate it is a return filter. Now drag a suitable reverb plug onto the return track, making sure you drop it after the return filter. The reverb must be set up to produce wet signal only, with none of the original dry signal sent to its outputs at all. In this case, that means setting the dry mix knob to 0%, but other plugs will have a wet mix knob which you will need to set to 100%, while others may have separate gain controls for dry and wet levels. Now you need to drag an AUX send filter onto the first track you wish to send to the reverb. For a post-fade send, you need to make sure you drop it after the main volume filter for that track, so that adjustments to the main level of that track will also change the effect level. Choose the same bus as the return filter. The filter icon should now display the bus name along with an S prefix to indicate it is a send. This can now be copied to all other tracks you need to send to the reverb. And the individual send level for each track can then be adjusted using the horizontal faders on the filters, while the global effect level can be adjusted using the volume filter on the return track. The return track can also be routed to a subgroup if needed. For example, if you set up a reverb for just the drum kit, you can route the reverb return to the drum group along with all the dry signals, so that adjusting the overall level of the kit will also adjust its reverb level. If you put the reverb return track inside the same folder as its send tracks, you should switch the volume filter on that track to ignore VCA, so that adjusting the drum levels with the VCA filter does not change the volume of the reverb return. One small problem we have now is that soloing any of the tracks will mute the reverb return track along with all the others, so our soloed track will lose the effect. We can cure this by selecting the return track and pressing its solo isolate button. Now we have a true solo in place function, which retains all the panning and effects of soloed tracks. AUX sends are also traditionally used to create alternative foldback mixes to feed musicians' monitors or headphones. This is set up the same way, but instead of adding an effect after the return filter, you should select the return track and route it to the required output. The send filters should then be placed before the main volume filters on the send tracks, so that the main mix balance can be adjusted without affecting the monitor mix. This is called a pre-fade send. Most other filters can also be set up so that the most important parameter can be adjusted directly from the edit page. Right-click the filter and choose the parameter from the Select Quick Control Parameter menu. This parameter will now be displayed on the filter and can be edited in the same way as the send level on the AUX send filters. Some plugs will introduce extra latency on top of your system latency. This is because certain processes are impossible to achieve in real time. As a general rule of thumb, compressors or limiters that use a look-ahead algorithm and linear phase equalizers will all introduce a small delay on the signal they process, as will most reverbs that use a convolution engine. This delay usually makes such plugs unsuitable for use on live audio inputs, as, in the absence of any form of time travel, there is no way for Tracktion to predict the input signal in advance. However, When processing pre-recorded clips, Tracktion is able to automatically compensate for this delay according to the plugin delay compensation information supplied by the plug. This automatic delay compensation is enabled by default. Select a track and check the Advance field in the Properties panel. As long as the Auto Advance button above it is enabled, Tracktion will automatically adjust the timing of that track to compensate for the combined latency of all the plugs on that track. Delay compensation will also work in combination with subgroups. Adding a non-real-time plug to a group track will automatically advance all the tracks that are routed to it, although the advance value will be displayed on the group track. Unfortunately, this will not work with the standard aux-send filters. Using a non-real-time reverb plug in a standard aux-send setup will result in an extra pre-delay on the reverb signal equivalent to that plug's latency. It is possible to set up an auxiliary send that does compensate for latency, but you need to use a rack. This will be explained in the Rack Filters chapter. The master section can be selected by clicking anywhere on the fader or the filter area, and this brings up various options in the Properties panel. If you type a value into the fade-in box, Tracktion will automatically apply a fade-in at the start of the edit, which is represented by a curve superimposed on the timeline at the top of the edit. You can also specify a fade out, and Tracktion will set the end of the fade to the end of the last clip in the edit. The type of curves can be changed using the buttons underneath. You can normalize an edit or part of an edit using the Find Normalized Level button. Choosing max level will set the master fader so that the loudest peak hits exactly 0 dB full scale, and so is totally non-destructive. If you want to normalize to a slightly lower level, simply lower the master fader a little bit afterwards. The Rms Normalize is similar, but it uses a special type of averaging to calculate signal levels rather than using the peak level. This means it will do a much better job of matching the volume levels of different audio files, but unless you set a suitably low target value, you will risk clipping the peaks. Again, this function analyzes the edit and then just sets the master volume fader accordingly, so it's totally non-destructive and the results can be adjusted if needed before rendering. Filters can be dragged to the area just above the master fader, in which case they will affect the entire mix, and these filters come before the master fader in the signal chain. This means that if you use a limiter or a third-party metering plug in the master section, you will probably need to keep the master fader at unity. If necessary, you can add an extra volume filter to the master section before the limiter or meter plugs, and use that as the master fader instead. An interesting feature of Tracktion is that if you have several pairs of audio outputs in use, the filters in the master section will affect them all independently. In other words, if you drag a native Tracktion filter into the master section, you are actually creating several filters, one for each pair of outputs, and these all share the same settings in the Properties panel. This is a useful feature if you want to filter out some low-end rubbish from all your outputs at once, but if you try it with a complex plug such as Final Mix, you may find your processor starts to struggle. If you want to be able to use individual inserts for specific outputs, you can set this up using Tracktion's subgrouping features. Create a new track for each pair of outputs you want to use, then select each track in turn, route it to a specific output pair, and name the track after that pair. Now go through the other tracks in the edit and route them to the appropriate group tracks instead of directly to the outputs. Each output can now be processed or metered independently using the group tracks, which can be hidden away in a folder when not needed.